relationship is incredibly strong. So I think, the concept of virality no longer sort of exists in the marketing context. It used to be a view that you could just upload a piece of really great content and it would find an audience. But I think, this has been proven many times that hardly ever happens. It's a little bit sort of like a lightning strike when it does. And so brands really need to consider both the content creation side and the distribution side. The relationship is incredibly close, from a point of view of how good the content is and how easy it is to find an audience. And the reason is this, right? So the first thing is that the quality of the content in a lot of online platforms where you pay for views has a very close relationship to what you actually pay for in terms of the cost. So the better the content, the less you pay on platforms like YouTube. And this is something called a quality score. So the quality of the content dictates what you end up paying per view on YouTube and a lot of other platforms like that. So that's the first one. So if you're looking to pay for an audience, you pay a lot less with great content. So that's a really great thing. Then the second thing is sort of organic discovery, and that's sort of the idea of SEO. And on a platform like YouTube, the way organic discovery works is that it's either from suggested videos on the left-hand side or the right-hand side of what you're watching on YouTube. So that's the one, and then the other one is through search on both YouTube and on Google. What's interesting about that side of discoverability is that the quality of the content has a huge part to play around how easy it is to find certain things. And so YouTube's invested a lot of time and energy in making sure that the algorithm for finding and sort of revealing content is as accurate as possible, and people find exactly what they're after. And so the algorithm actually takes view time of videos as a really big part of the sort of quality score and the likelihood of sort of discoverability. So traditionally it was like the videos with the most views are the easiest ones to find, and that's no longer the case. It's the ones which have the highest average view time, which are now the easiest to find on YouTube. And view time is a really good proxy for quality of the content. So from an organic point of view, it makes a huge difference as well in terms of the quality of the content and how easy it is to find. And then the final one, sort of if you look at sort of the three pillars of distribution, the idea of seeding, where you take a piece of content and you share it with as many different websites as possible and see if they'd like to feature it or not. And this can either be done in a paid form or sort of organically, where you literally just send the content to them. If it's good enough, they will flight it. There are 1,000 websites just like BuzzFeed, but with much smaller audiences. But when you put those all together, they can sort of add up to a really sizable audience. And in this case, the quality of the content is the only reason they would end up flighting it, unless you paid it. And so every step along the way, the quality of the content dictates how easy it is to get an audience. But you need to absolutely consider the two hand in hand. And if it's done well, then you can have massive, massive volumes of views, but it all needs to be considered. Yeah, so if you look at the history of advertising, and if you look at the vast majority of advertising made today, it's made in the same way. You have a very linear process where you have a creative team, a production team, and then a media team. And the reality is that while it shouldn't always be this way, sort of most of the time, it's a very downstream process. So the media agency will very often only sort of see what work is being created once it's been created. And so there's not a sort of vast amount of transferable sort of information between those two departments. I think the future of the world is one where you have the audience and the creators sort of with deep level of insight into both. So if you have a look at sort of YouTube stars today, they have a very good understanding of what their audience likes because they've pushed out so much work to them over a long period of time, and they get comments and incredibly in-depth feedback. At the same time, they also know which videos get the highest view time. So this amount of insight which you gather about what your audience likes absolutely informs what you're going to create in the future. And when brands work with these creators, the creators know exactly what to do to make sure that they get the biggest possible audience. And they just have this incredibly good idea of what their audience likes because they've pushed out so many videos over such a long period of time, and they've got really good sort of feedback around what works and what doesn't. So, the benefits of understanding the audience really well and then working with brands to create content for that audience is just absolutely incredible. And so we're building sort of YouTube channels with exactly this model where we're sort of building up a deep understanding of what our audience likes, and then we're working with brands to take branded messages to that audience. And I think it makes an incredibly compelling story when you have this insight into what that audience likes, and I think it's absolutely the way of the future. So that's sort of a business model which is our sort of distribution model, which we work within MoFilm. And MoFilm's sort of traditional model is that we have filmmakers all around the world, and we have sort of a creative team who come up with sort of a filmmaker's brief. And this is sort of a really good interpretation of what the client wants. What you want to do is sort of be able to describe this very succinctly to a lot of filmmakers, so they just get it really quickly. If they really understand what the client's after, and then you have a whole host of different filmmakers who can have their own interpretation of that brief, then yeah, you get a whole sort of rich amount of different ideas which you can never get in the sort of the traditional process. And I think one of a really interesting benefit is that you can have sort of a centralized big idea for a big global client, and then you can roll that big idea out across different markets around the world, and in each of those different markets you can have local interpretation, local insight, but all feeding off this big idea. So I think both of these models are really interesting. I'd say they both are absolutely disruptive. I think the traditional agency model will be around for many years to come, and that's definitely not going away. But I think it's really interesting to look at when these new types of models are just better than the old model. And as I say, it's not going to be all the time, but there are certain instances where it absolutely is. So look, I mean, it's super interesting, right? If you look at both YouTube and Facebook, the majority of views are happening on mobile devices now, so more than half. I think Facebook, the figure is 75%. I think what's interesting about a view on a mobile device is I just think it is such an incredibly engaged view. So if you're standing with your phone in your hand and you're looking at a video, 100% of your attention is on that video. And the fascinating thing about online video is that you've chosen to watch that one video instead of everything else on the internet at that moment, right? You could have chosen to do anything with that time, but you've chosen to watch that video. And it's a device you hold in your hand, and so that engagement is incredibly close. What I think is interesting is when you sort of take that sort of environment and you measure it against sort of a passive viewing environment like TV, where the audience may or may not be watching, and it's sort of in the background and it's sort of not been chosen at that point. I think it's just such a massive difference. I mean, it really is. And so yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer in the future of mobile video. I think it's the best way to reach people on mobile devices by a long way. But to be clear, I don't think that you could interrupt people on mobile devices in the same way as you can in other environments, because people, people are, with a mobile device, you have so many other options, and if you're sort of interrupted with a message, it's just so easy not to engage. So I think, the old world is a sort of interruption economy, where advertisers interrupted people to communicate their message, and the future is absolutely an engagement economy. You can only get people to engage with your content if they choose specifically at that moment to engage with your content. And I think relative to all the other environments out there from an advertising point of view, I think it's incredibly powerful because of that. But I think advertisers in the old world could create boring content and get a meaningful audience. Advertisers in the future cannot create boring content because they will not get an audience. And I think that's incredibly fair, and that's, we're sitting in the Cannes Lions today, and I think it's just a great place to sort of make that point, because this is an environment where you reward creative work, and mobile is an environment where great creative work is rewarded.